Well, Katherine Blunt, thank you so much for doing this. I'm a big fan of your book, California Burning, and I'm excited to talk about it today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So, can we just start with your background and what prompted you to write this book?
Sure. I have spent my whole career in journalism, first in San Antonio and then in Houston. And when I was living in Houston, I joined the Wall Street Journal in late 2018. Our energy office is based there. And that was 3 days before the Camp Fire that destroyed the town of Paradise on November 8th, 2018. And it became clear within a matter of weeks that PG&E was going to be a really big and important story because the company made a disclosure that it was very likely that one of its power lines ignited that fire. Ultimately, within a couple of months, it sought bankruptcy protection, citing $30 billion in potential liability costs tied to that fire and a series of fires in 2017. So I worked with a couple of very talented colleagues to kind of examine not only why the factors and circumstances that led to that particular disaster, but really the many challenges that coalesced over the course of about 20 years to create such challenging circumstances for this company. That work was really the foundation for this book, which I went on to write myself. And I was grateful for that opportunity because it is such a complex story. So to have the chance to tell it at length was really valuable. And I'm glad to say that's the feedback I've gotten from folks in the industry and outside.
Yeah, it really is a complex story. It weaves policy and technology and politics together. And it's particularly meaningful for people who live in Northern California. We can get into that more. But so just taking a step back, and this has changed over time, and we'll talk about this, but what role does PG&E currently play in California?
PG&E is the utility monopoly serving pretty much all of Northern and Central California as a service territory covering 70,000 square miles. It certainly, serves the San Francisco and the Bay Area, but also the rural, more rugged territory in Sierra foothills, right? And so it's got a very geographically diverse service territory, but one in which, a lot of people are dependent on the service. So it's very, very important for the people in Northern California and for the California economy.
And what is the role in the government in terms of overseeing PG&E, particularly the California Public Utilities Commission?
Right. So as with most every investor-owned utility, it's kind of granted monopoly status in exchange for submitting to regulatory oversight. So in this case, the California Public Utilities Commission is the body that is tasked with overseeing the utility spending. So it has to approve requests to raise rates, review those requests, make sure that the requests are, considered prudent and the company is proposing the right sorts of work, but also overseeing the safe and reliable operations of the utility as well. So the regulator does have a very big role to play. And historically, this has been a big challenge because, the PUC not only oversees PG&E, but also the Southern California utilities and other aspects of other industries as well. So it's one of the biggest PUCs in the country and has a lot of responsibility.
There are certainly a lot of different stakeholders involved here. But going back in time, can you provide just a brief history behind the creation of the entity that we now know as PG&E?
Yep. So PG&E formed kind of as a result of sort of the mergers and acquisitions of lots of tiny little power companies that were cropping up throughout Northern California in the late 1800s and early 1900s, as kind of electricity was becoming something that could be seen as a commodity, right? That was like when that was evolving and there was a push toward electrifying cities and replacing gas lamps. So PG&E formed in 1905, again, sort of as the combination of a lot of these tiny companies. And it only ever had one real competitor. It was a company called Great Western Power, really one of my favorite historical power companies that was building a massive hydroelectric system to carry hydroelectric powerhouses that were going to send power to the Bay Area. And the PG&E and Great Western ultimately merged in 1930 after a decade or so of pretty fierce competition, creating the Northern California monopoly that we know today. That was really the final piece of the puzzle. And it really gave PG&E a lot of financial might, the ability to support massive population growth after World War II. But with that, PG&E inherited a lot of legacy infrastructure that this other company built that ultimately it kind of lost track of, frankly, over time. And it was a Great Western power line that failed and ignited the Camp Fire. It was a hook on a transmission tower that was almost exactly 100 years old that ultimately failed after, a century of use and wear and tear. So pretty remarkable.
I don't want to give away too many anecdotes from the book, but that hook really stuck with me because you also talk about how the manufacturer of that hook, which I think was sold to the PG&E, or at least to the precursor of PG&E in 1919, the manufacturer of that hook, 5 years later in 1924, came out with a more corrosion-resistant version of it. I feel like if you are already saying to yourself that we would be in a better position if we had the 1924 version, that in and of itself is a bad sign.
Yeah.
That anecdote really stuck with me just in terms of how old this infrastructure is that daily provides us with electricity, but is also fading quickly.
Yep, absolutely. I mean, some of this was really built at it. If we're talking about the transmission system, I mean, the parts of the transmission system are among the oldest, right, in the entire PG&E system. And it was built some of it was built around the time when long distance transmission was still kind of experimental, right? So it's going to be like kind of iterative around that time, and companies are going to figure out better and better ways to do it. And the fact that this particular hook was 100 years old ultimately before it failed is kind of remarkable. I mean, it lasted for a while, but just as remarkable in a bad way is the fact that PG&E never replaced it or never looked closely enough at it to determine whether it was about to give out.
Right. But part of the problem here is that for PG&E to sort of monitor and maintain all of the infrastructure, a lot of it is difficult for them to access.
Yeah,
right?
that is definitely part of the problem. A lot of this is built in the Sierra foothills, in sort of like in this particular case, we're talking about a transmission line that was running down a very sort of rugged and steep canyon. That access is difficult. And in order, like historically speaking, one of the best ways to look at these teeny tiny pieces of hardware is to send somebody up to climb into the tower and to get a close look. These days you can use drones, you can use other technology that makes it a little bit easier, but that hasn't been true for the majority of the time that tower was in service, is no longer in service now. It's kind of, when you think about the calculation there, though, I mean, you think about sort of the man hours and the labor and the cost of like actually sending somebody there, whether it be by helicopter or somehow by truck and then on foot to get up there. I mean, yes, it's costly and time consuming, but then you think about, I mean, the cost of what happened in the aftermath of the failure of that hook, right? Like action is much less costly than inaction. I think PG&E is coming to learn that very much so.
Right. So that's a good segue into just the business model of an entity like PG&E. So I can go buy shares in PG&E. What are investor funds typically put towards for a company like PG&E?
Right. So if you're an investor in PG&E or any other investor-owned utility, right? That's the model. What you're basically expecting a guaranteed rate of return on your equity, right? I mean, that's kind of that is the business model. So the regulator allows PG&E to recoup costs. That's kind of two buckets, right? There's big capital investments that add to the overall value of the system. And there's day-to-day operations and maintenance costs. I mean, replacing teeny tiny parts like the hook we're talking about, doing inspections, doing surveying equipment, making sure everything is running as it should. And so you can recoup both of these things. You can recoup the cost of the capital investments. You can recoup the cost of O&M. But on capital investments, the regulator authorizes a set rate of return. So, you invest $100 and you get, an additional 9 as a 9%, 10%, but in some cases 11%, 12% rate of return. And that's what sort of investors are banking on and come to expect. And so utilities that are strong financial performers are good at sort of minimizing O&M and freeing up money to invest as capital, and therefore earning better and more consistent returns for shareholders. But the balancing act is making sure that you're not cutting too close to the bone on that really critical O&M, because that is really what is necessary to guarantee the safe and reliable operation of the system. And PG&E historically struggled to strike that balance properly. It cut too close to the bone on certain inspections and maintenance practices, which is what led to some of the major disasters that we've seen. But PG&E is not the only utility that's struggled with this. It's just had some of the most catastrophic consequences.
That's the trade-off that PG&E leadership has to make, right? They can either spend that money maintaining systems, which would reduce the likelihood for some sort of tragic event. That would also be very costly. Or they can apply those funds to future projects, right?
Yes. I mean, it would be, if we're talking about projects, I mean, basically the way to think about it is what adds to the value of PG&E's system, right? Is it a new transmission line worth $10 million? Is it upgrading a bunch of substations? Now the substations are worth more money. That's a capital investment. I mean, the inspections and the maintenance, it's hard to, even though it has value intrinsically, it's kind of hard to value it financially. So that's why you just recoup the cost without making a return on it.
Right. So I think in reading the book, it becomes apparent that there are some drawbacks to structuring utilities in this way, in the sense that they are shareholder owned. What is the argument for this structure? Like, is there an argument that it's the sort of least bad way to do it?
There is that argument. I mean, the reason this model even came to be is it was understood to be the most efficient means of these companies having access to capital, right? It's a very capital intensive business. And I mean, what are your choices, right? It's either private investors or basically taxpayer money. You see an investor owned model in which money comes from private markets or just comes from stock market or debt or whatever. You see in some cases like city owned utilities, municipal utilities, in which it's all taxpayer funding, muni bonds and such. And then there's a kind of a model that you see in more rural areas called a cooperative, in which the utility is owned by its customers, but they don't have access to capital like an IOU, right? And so there's this idea that this sort of regulated, guaranteed, I mean, for the most part, unless some massive disaster happens, a utility company is basically guaranteed not only revenue, but profits, right? Like, why wouldn't an investor want to own it? And so that's been the argument, but you're beginning to see this kind of break down in the context of utilities incurring massive liability costs, which is what we're talking about. But yeah, I mean, this stuff costs tens of millions of dollars to maintain, like new infrastructure costs billions of dollars to build. And so that's, again, the simple argument is access to capital to do that efficiently and effectively.
Right. In a perfect world, investors would fund the construction of new energy systems. The general public would benefit from the creation of those systems, and a government entity would sort of cap the rates at which the utility can charge for use of that energy, so the investors don't sort of squeeze maybe too much money out of the system.
Yep, exactly.
That's essentially how sort of California over time settled on this current system. The drawback is when there's a very tragic event, it exposes the misalignment of incentives in the system, right?
Right. Yeah, and we've seen that twice now with PG&E. The first big example was actually in 2010 when a natural gas pipeline exploded in San Bruno, which is just south of San Francisco. It killed 8 people, destroyed part of a neighborhood. Subsequent criminal trial really revealed the fact that the company knew that there were risks in the gas transmission system, but wasn't doing enough to inspect and fix those problems. They'd really cut back on inspections, which is, again, that's just a pass-through cost, that's O&M. And they were not using the inspection method that would have been the best to detect the risks because it was more expensive than the method that they were using. And that's clearly a problem, right? And you can't draw a straight line between like sort of that decision-making and what happened with San Bruno, but it was close enough to result in a successful prosecution. The company was convicted on, I think, 6 counts of violating federal pipeline safety law. And then with that, you saw something kind of chillingly similar in the wake of the Camp Fire. The company had, over the course of many years, reduced the thoroughness and frequency of the inspections of its transmission system. That's a decision made on a dollars and cents basis. So, and then ultimately that hook failed, right? And a more expensive and thorough inspection process probably would have caught that. But instead, that hook was there for 100 years, swaying in the wind until it broke in half.
Yeah. So what was behind PG&E's first bankruptcy, and what was the result coming out of that?
Oof. California energy crisis of 2000 and 2001. So partly as a result of, there was a number of things that happened sort of after World War II that resulted in interest across the United States in quote unquote deregulating the electricity business. And that's very much a misnomer. Utilities, in terms of the companies that maintain the wires that move power around, will always be regulated, right? That's not really what was being contemplated here. Instead, what was being contemplated was taking the generation side of things, power plants specifically, and making it so that utilities didn't own them anymore. And instead allowing competitive companies to own them and compete to sell the output at the lowest possible cost. So you're taking a very specific portion of the utility business and turning it into a competitive business rather than something that's, the utilities no longer be vertically integrated, right? You take off the generation part, create a competitive market. Without getting too much in the weeds, California was the first state to really begin this experiment in earnest and created a power market structure that was very vulnerable to manipulation. And so there was a period of time in which power supplies became more expensive naturally because natural gas became more expensive, making power more expensive to generate. There were some issues with hydropower, just in terms of not having a sort of a lack of abundance there. And then on top of that, some of the new competitive generation companies, as well as the traders that were playing in the market, figured out ways to game the system and drove power prices through the roof. And the utility companies that were then buying power from these new entities, as part of the new market structure, there was a cap on how much they were able to charge customers for the cost of electricity. And so anything above that threshold basically resulted in them taking on a lot of debt. And when wholesale prices were, they were really, really, really high for a long time, artificially so. And each of California's big utilities took on a lot of debt. PG&E was the only one to file for bankruptcy because its challenges were the most acute. And then it emerged around 2004, 2005. And in my view, the most significant consequence of that was, it was a really remarkable bankruptcy in that you so rarely see a major utility bankruptcy, as we've been talking about. They're basically guaranteed the ability to make money and then make a profit on it. And so to see such a failure, so to speak, was very consequential. And so the company was very interested in regaining goodwill on Wall Street. This is a little bit more complicated, but because California was interested in having this competitive power market, the utility companies, in the wake of this restructuring, were no longer going to own a lot of generation, right? They had sold off a lot of these plants as part of the deregulation process. And so as California is pushing to cleaner sources of energy, mandating the procurement of wind and solar power, PG&E is contracting with these wind and solar developers to help the state meet its clean energy targets. Contracts are kind of treated like O&M. You don't earn on them. It's just an expense. And when we're talking about contracts in 2005, 2006, 2007, wind and solar power were much, much, much more expensive than they are today. And some of that early spending helped create economies of scale that we have today in the renewable energy space, driving down costs. But those early contracts are really expensive, kind of creating additional cost pressure. So those are sort of the two consequences of the deregulation and the subsequent bankruptcy.
So in terms of deregulation, that word, it's interesting because these markets aren't entirely deregulated, right? They're just less regulated than they once were, in the sense that no utility has a sort of legal monopoly in their territory, correct?
I don't know if I would quite put it that way. I think that, so when you think about, let's think about, if just not to shift too much, but like Texas has the most competitive power market in the country. The utility companies there don't own any power plants. They only own the big high voltage transmission wires that carry power over long distances, and then the smaller wires that distribute it to homes and businesses, right? They own the grid, so to speak, or they operate the grid rather, and do own the infrastructure. They are utility companies and they are subject to regulatory oversight. Same in California. PG&E owns like a handful of generation, not very much. The same with Southern California Edison and SDG&E. They're all they are utilities subject to regulation by the public service commissions. But it's just the generation space, the companies that own the power plants themselves are technically not regulated by like something like a PUC. There is still some regulatory oversight at the federal level and some other like general requirements that they're beholden to, but they are not regulated. They compete to sell output. So the utility companies still have their monopolies in exchange for that, submitting to that regulatory oversight. But in places where the utilities don't own the generation, that's the unregulated bit.
Got it. Okay. Makes total sense. Can we talk a little bit about how events in Southern California have affected PG&E over time? Just sort of particularly with the way that energy policy in the state has changed based on things that have happened in the southern part of the state outside of PG&E's territory.
Are you talking about like the witch fire in 2007?
Yeah, exactly.
So San Diego Gas and Electric is the smallest of the state's investor-owned utilities. It had a major incident in 2007 when one of its power lines ignited what became known as the witch fire. Very destructive, very deadly. And it prompted the California Public Utilities Commission to begin thinking about whether it should do more to push each of the state's utility companies to do more to address fire risk. I mean, good, smart question, naturally. And so this regulatory proceeding begins in which the regulators ask this question. The utilities all come back with their thoughts on what they should do or shouldn't have to do or whatever. And PG&E comes back with an argument basically saying that fire risk historically has not been as high in Northern California compared to Southern California, and therefore it shouldn't be held to the same standard as the Southern California utilities. Frankly, a pretty specious argument even at the time, because in 2008, there was like 1,500 fires that ignited throughout California, a lot of which were in Northern California. And you could even just see it from space, like a satellite passing over just showed this gray cloud just emanating from Northern California. And these fires were mostly lightning caused. This was like not a big thing for PG&E itself. But nevertheless, it was showing how the risk profile of the Northern California service territory was changing. And the reason was you're beginning to see at this time some periods of very severe drought, which pretty much decimated the health of the forest. So all of a sudden you've got thousands of trees dead, then millions of trees, then tens of millions of trees. And so the consequence of infrastructure failure becomes much higher at that point, right? If a power line fails in a forest, what might have been a 3-acre fire pretty easily containable, all of a sudden blazes out of control because there's just no shortage of fuel, right? And so nevertheless, the PUC ultimately agreed with PG&E and said, PG&E, you do not need to create a formal wildfire prevention plan, whereas the two southern utilities do. And so as a result, San Diego Gas and Electric and Southern California Edison really began thinking about wildfire risk mitigation more formally and much earlier than PG&E did. And it ultimately took the two kind of disaster years that PG&E had, first in 2017 and then 2018, for the PUC to really require and demand the same of PG&E. And so it's unfortunate that it so often takes a disaster. And in this case, more than 100 people died collectively.
Yeah. In terms of mitigating the risk of wildfires, what are some of the things that PG&E can do? We touched on this. It is very difficult, probably impossible for them to get the risk down to somewhere near zero, partially just because there are so many wires all around their territory. Some of those wires are in very remote areas. What are some of the sort of maintenance and upkeep that they can do to mitigate the risk as much as possible?
Yeah, well, certainly in the wake of the disasters, they did this whole big inspection blitz trying to figure out what was falling apart and what needed to be addressed urgently. And they found a lot of things. So there's just the basic question of what's on the verge of failure. Are you able to identify it and replace it? That's sort of the basic thrust. There's also, we haven't really talked very much about the 2017 fires. Those ignited, it was like more than a dozen fires that ignited mostly in the wine country area of California and Napa and Sonoma counties. And those occurred when tree limbs hit live wires in windy conditions. This is really the primary cause of a lot of utility fires, when a branch gets tangled up in a live wire. And so it's why utilities have these big, robust, what they call vegetation management programs. It's when they send a bunch of contractors out into the field in bucket trucks to try to make sure that the branches are far enough away from the wires for safety and reliability reasons. And so there's that. I mean, they can do more effective, quote unquote, vegetation management or tree trimming, but it's like Sisyphus rolling the rock up the hill, right? It's like you cut the tree grows back. It's very expensive. And it's just sort of this constant cycle. And so, not to mention, when the winds pick up often in the fall, seasonally, I mean, you could have a tree branch or tree scraps or whatever blow into a wire from 60 yards away, right? There's you can never totally guarantee that that's not going to happen. And so PG&E has been trying to get its arms around this, and sort of the two mitigation measures that it's been relying pretty heavily on is sort of twofold. Any wires in high threat fire areas now trip off if something touches them pretty much all year round. And then when we're talking about these super windy periods in the fall, the company might proactively shut off the power if it detects that sort of weather system coming through, so that, again, if you have that branch fly in from 60 yards away, it's going to be, the power's off. So it's going to touch a dead wire, so to speak. And ignition risk is next to nothing in that case. And so, but there's a reliability trade-off with that, right? Either longer and more frequent power outages, which is kind of hard to stomach, especially if we're talking about increasing reliance on electricity for electric vehicles, or cooking, or for home heating and all that. So the question becomes what is the permanent risk reduction measure? And I think there's always going to be some combination of these tools used. PG&E has been pushing for a strategy that would involve burying a lot of its highest risk circuits so that, because if it's underground, it can't get hit by a tree or, it's like the ignition risk is basically nothing. But the problem, though, is just that that's not only time consuming, but also expensive, which has been a tough pill to swallow in a very inflationary environment in a state that has some of the highest electricity rates in the country.
Right. And that type of project is not the type of project that investors would recoup a significant return
No,
on.
it is actually. So that's the other part of it. Some of the pushback from sort of like consumer advocates is like there are cheaper ways to do this that aren't possibly not as beneficial to shareholders, but like they've been, so another mitigation method that's been contemplated is insulating the wires. So it's called tree wire, right? So if a tree touches it, the ignition risk is much less. It's not zero like it would be if it's undergrounded, but it's less. So they're saying like you should do more of that in conjunction with other technologies and tools, and it wouldn't be as expensive. It would be substantially less expensive. But PG&E instead is saying we want zero risk on these circuits, not a little bit of risk.
Right. I saw a video recently. I don't know if it was in California, and I'm not sure when it was from, but there was basically a sort of giant chainsaw that was hanging from a helicopter, and the helicopter was kind of hovering over a power line and swinging the chainsaw back and forth along the tree line.
Yeah.
It basically reinforced to me just how difficult it is to mitigate that wildfire risk, which, as you mentioned, is often caused by trees falling on live wires or something, just the amount of vegetation around those wires, which have electricity running through them.
Yes. I've seen that video too. It's like terrifying.
Yeah. And I think you mentioned in the book at some point, it may have switched again since then, but there was PG&E at first, they tried to have the tree line 1.5 feet away from the wires, and then they switched that to 4 feet back. It may have switched, but it's just not super easy for them to accomplish that right away.
No, and that was a result of a change in regulatory requirements. So then all of a sudden, they're already spending a ton of money working trees to a certain standard, and then the standard changes and the worker crews have to go back out and do it all over again. And so, vegetation management is very challenging for a lot of reasons.
Yeah. So you mentioned this, but can you talk a little bit about the role that climate change plays in this book, both in terms of the environmental impacts, obviously, as well as the policy side in California?
Yeah. So most simply, the periods of devastating drought that made it so that there was tens of millions of dead trees throughout Northern California. Scientists say unequivocally these droughts are made worse by climate change. And so that's not to say that climate change has caused this problem, but is playing into it, right? It's like a hotter, drier climate means less water for the trees, made worse by the fact that if you have a tree that's on the verge of dying, it invites these invasive pests called bark beetles that just kind of finish it off. So you've got like a bark beetle infestation and periods of drought. So that again, if a power line fails in the middle of the forest, the prospect of a massive, uncontrollable wildfire is higher than it's been historically. So that's kind of problem number one. And California, of course, was one of the earliest movers in thinking about climate change in the context of reducing carbon emissions. And the utilities became key in achieving some of the state's climate targets because the state began pushing early to facilitate the push to renewable energy and requiring the utility companies to go out and contract for increasing amounts of clean power, mostly wind and solar. And both within the company or within the companies, each of California's utilities, as well as within the Public Utilities Commission, this was like a good place to be, right? Like you're seen favorably by state leadership. It's kind of like sexy and new and like it's a good story, right? We're like trying to reduce carbon emissions. We are, whether you're at the utility company negotiating the contracts or you're at the PUC overseeing the execution of the contracts, there was just a lot of time, money, and resources spent on this endeavor on both sides. And as a result, on both sides, there was less emphasis on just kind of the unsexy day-to-day operations and maintenance stuff. This was especially true within the PUC, which is like kind of a thankless job to begin with. But like if you're going to do anything within the PUC, you wanted to be on the policy side. The safety division was like pretty chronically understaffed and under-resourced for a long time and simply didn't have the means or the wherewithal to really oversee what the utilities were doing. They kind of like just sort of trusted the utilities to do their jobs and to file appropriate paperwork. And they just sort of like audited records for a while. It wasn't enough to really get a good sense as to the risks. That PG&E's case, PG&E wasn't aware of the risk either in a lot of cases, or at least the specific risks, even as they knew risk was building. So clean energy advocates like often think I'm saying that there's some sort of either or choice here. It's like you either focus on sort of like immediate safety problems or like long-term carbon reduction efforts. No, both have to be done at the same time. This early shift to renewables was largely good in a lot of ways. I mean, significant carbon reductions, again, helped kind of create this early spending helped create the economies of scale that we have today, meaning that wind and solar are so much cheaper than they were 20 years ago. But the unfortunate thing is like as California and the state's big utilities sort of like looked at this climate change issue over like a long term, I mean, PG&E in particular sort of failed to recognize the extent to which climate change was creating immediate risks that they needed to deal with imminently. And so I think the question for any utility at this time is like, as you're trying to achieve clean energy targets and such, I mean, do you have commensurate resources on the operational side to address climate-driven operational risk? And I'm certain that not every utility can say that confidently.
Might be a tough question, but if you were going to give advice to incoming CEO of PG&E, what would you say?
I often joke sometimes, I'm not a big South Park fan, but there is a really funny episode about Captain Hindsight. It's like, I kind of feel like I am Captain Hindsight. I kind of fly in and I tell you what could have been done differently, but I stray away from giving advice or being proactive in my assessment. But I think the big question facing PG&E right now is like, we were talking earlier about how do you reduce the risk? And right now you've got just sort of this unfortunate trade-off in which reliability is being substantially impacted. And whereas I think that a power outage is almost always better than a catastrophic wildfire, even if it lasts for several days. It's like, that's not an easy thing to ask customers to deal with. Not just because it's inconvenient, but you have people who are truly reliant on electricity, right? For medical reasons or any other reason that makes it so that anything more than an hour or two is really hard. And so what can be done to make that trade-off less? I don't know. And then the answer, of course, is like putting all the wires underground, but that's impossible, right? It's just too expensive. You can't do that everywhere. And so I don't know. I just think that like right now, the utility is really trumpeting this significant reduction in ignitions. Yes, that's a good thing, no doubt. We don't want catastrophic wildfires in Northern California, but it has at this time come at the expense of reliability. That can't last forever, right? Especially as we move toward this future that California wants and a lot of the rest of the country wants, in which we're really phasing out other fuels for use in the home. It's just going to be ever more reliant on electricity. So I don't know what the right answer is, but like that's the status quo as it stands, I don't think can hold for very much longer. So it's tough.
I certainly don't know either what the right answer is. And honestly, my takeaway from the book was that there really is no easy answer or solution.
That's right.
I became more convinced of that as the book went on. But it really, I think the book does a great job of hammering home that there really are just all these different interests and not everyone is just entirely aligned. And there are these events that happen that sort of expose that, but still day to day, most of the time, the system works well.
Right. No, there is really no easy solution. And that's as frustrating as it is. Like, I hope that those who read the book come to understand that, because I mean, there's so much conversation as it relates to PG&E is like, oh, this would be as simple as a state takeover, or why doesn't San Francisco become a municipal utility, or why doesn't the company just bury all the wires right now? And just like stuff it's just none of this solves it. It's either, the solution is either impossible or you solve some problems while creating others. It's like, there's no simple and straight path forward. If there was, someone would have found it and done it.
Right. We've talked definitely about some of the shortcomings on PG&E's record. In researching for the book, I'm sure you talked to a lot of PG&E employees. What were some of the best decisions that you think PG&E leadership made along the way?
Well, in the wake of San Bruno, PG&E actually did a pretty good job at overhauling the gas division to be much more safety oriented. In particular, I talked to the guy who spearheaded that transformation. And he was a lot of fun to talk to, for one, but he's proud of that work. It was difficult work, certainly. I mean, the gas system is complicated and there was all kinds of issues that they had to address, but they did so effectively. However, the gas division is much, much smaller than the electric division within PG&E. So the electric division is more complicated. I think that new leadership, when you think about PG&E, it's like if you are going in to be any sort of senior executive within this company, you are doing so because like you're motivated by the desire to like really affect change, right? I mean, if you're a utility expert of any kind, you can get a similar job at a less problem-riddled utility and make just as much money, right? You're not doing this for the money. You're doing this because you're trying to make a real change in sort of the culture and operation of this company that just has not been able to get it right for like 20 years. And so I think that the new CEO, Patty Poppe, has been really trying to sort of break down some of the barriers that employees have historically encountered in trying to make leadership aware of problems, creating a culture in which people would feel more free to express their concerns and things that they've seen on the ground and sort of like make it so that the leadership sitting in the top floor office knows what's happening in the field, which is really important. And so I think that that's smart. That being said, I mean, I know that there's still frustration among employees as to like how certain things are done and or not done, or, you know, we're talking like a 20,000, 25,000 person company, again, with a service territory that covers 70,000 square miles, right? It's just a gargantuan undertaking to like have a comprehensive view of what's happening. And so, yeah. And I mean, I think that there's, for the employees that have stayed, right? I mean, the company's obviously seen a lot of turnover over the last 5, 10, 15 years for sure, especially the last like 5 after the bankruptcy. Those who have stayed, I think they feel compelled to kind of do the job and serve the community. But there's like PG&E is really persona non grata in Northern California, right? I mean, it's just like, most people really, really dislike this company. They don't trust it. They don't like the fact that they have to pay increasing amounts of money to a company that's just, again, has a really poor track record. And so I think contending with that is quite hard, especially for the folks who are closest to the people that they serve. And yeah, I mean, so I think it's kind of all over the place. I think that there's like certainly there's pride throughout different levels of the organization and finding success and reducing ignition rates and things like that. But this process is far from over. And then you have to contend with the fact that like it's going to be many, many years, if ever, that PG&E regains the trust of the people that it serves.
Yeah. You talk about this, but it sounds like when you were writing, you spoke with certain PG&E employees whose families have been working for PG&E for generations, and they take pride in the fact that they deliver power to not only the PG&E territory, but the San Francisco Bay Area is a very important place in the whole world. And PG&E has, to some degree, enabled some of that growth and the sort of prosperity and the innovation that has happened here. It does seem like PG&E as an organization really wants to do the best job possible. And part of that too, I think I saw, so is your book required reading for certain PG&E employees?
Yeah, it is required reading for senior leadership, which is gratifying to say the least. And other utility companies too, which is also awesome because I think that more of the industry is coming to understand that a lot of the problems PG&E has faced are like not unique to PG&E. So
yeah, totally. Taking a step back from PG&E specifically, at a higher level, what do you think the book is really about? Like, do you think there's a larger lesson for readers outside of the information they learn about PG&E and about California's energy system?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are a few challenges here that are kind of somewhat specific to California, but by and large, these issues are industry-wide, not just California specific and certainly not PG&E specific. I mean, if we're talking just about wildfire, just about wildfire. First, we see it in California, then in Colorado, then Oregon, then Colorado, then Hawaii, now Texas. The real possibility of utility companies being implicated in major fire disasters. And so I don't know if you saw this, but I mean, the Oregon utility grappling with major liability costs after a series of fires in 2020 over Labor Day is owned by Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway. And in his most recent shareholder letter, he was really kind of calling into question the viability of the investor and utility model in the West, right? If you've got a utility company exposed to significant liability costs. And so it's interesting when you have a voice like that, right? Paying attention to this issue and recognizing that utilities exposed to fire risk certainly need to be doing more. And can they even do enough, right? This is sort of a question we've been talking about this whole podcast. But the issue of new climate-driven risks is not just a question for utilities exposed to wildfire. I mean, if you have stronger, more frequent storms or whatever sort of iteration of climate risk you want to discuss, maybe for a utility on the East Coast, that doesn't mean catastrophic wildfire, but it means a days-long power outage. And like that can be just as devastating. You know, in Texas, during the sort of the massive grid failure of 2021 as a result of the freeze, some people were without power into freezing temperatures for 4 days, and more than 200 people died, right? You have people like burning furniture in their homes or like running the car in the garage and, you know, having all these like life-threatening decision-making borne by that necessity. And so it doesn't take much to see how any sort of grid failure can become a catastrophe very quickly. And so I think that there are lessons not just for utilities exposed to fire risk, even though there's a lot of that. This really is an industry-wide problem that is becoming a more urgent conversation for sure.
Right. You mentioned this in terms of the victims of some of these catastrophes. How ultimately did California settle on how to compensate them?
Yeah, PG&E's bankruptcy was hugely, hugely challenging, right? And there was a ton of competing interests. What was really kind of dismaying was the fact that the savviest investors who bought into sort of both the equity and the debt side in the wake of the fires did just fine. Were really able to make quite a bit of money on this disaster, whereas the actual fire victims really got the short end of the stick. And so what happened was, not to get too complicated about it, but at the end of the day, PG&E had to settle 3 major classes of claims. The first and the smallest was with governmental agencies that incurred fire suppression costs and other things. Easy settlement for $1 billion in cash. That was the first. The second bucket was what was known as quote unquote subrogation claims. And what this means is that in California, utility companies are strictly liable for damages resulting from fires their equipment starts, like regardless of negligence, regardless of anything. So that means if I'm an insurance company and I paid a claim to a homeowner who lost their home in such a fire, I can go to the utility company and ask for reimbursement because the liability is ultimately theirs. So you had insurance companies that were seeking reimbursement on these claims that they paid to PG&E. But there was a lot of insurance companies that didn't want to sit around and wait for a settlement. So they sold these claims on the secondary market to mostly hedge funds and like for pennies on the dollar, right? Just so they could have like a little bit of money and just sort of wash their hands of this whole complicated thing. And then those financiers that had bought the claims at a discount managed to negotiate this like really big $11 billion all cash settlement on which they made a lot of money. And so then the company's out $12 billion in cash. And when it comes time to settle with individual fire victims and people who actually lost stuff in these disasters, it didn't have enough cash to fully satisfy the value of their claims. So the settlement ultimately was $13.5 billion, half cash, half with shares in the company itself. And as you can imagine, these fire victims didn't take kindly to the fact that all of a sudden now they have shares in the company that burned down their towns, right? And so they didn't directly hold these shares. It wasn't like shares were doled out to individual fire victims. Instead, these shares were given to a trust it just very recently, like within the last few months, sold off the last shares that it had to liquidate them to be able to compensate these victims. But sort of adding insult to injury to this whole thing, PG&E's share price after the bankruptcy was very slow to recover. It was understood that the shares were going to trade at like 14 in order for this trust to be the value that it was supposed to, the nominal $13.5 billion value. We're trading at like 7 or 8 for like a long time. So this trust had to really wait until the market conditions were such that they could liquidate these shares in a way that would be most beneficial to the fire victims. But nevertheless, I mean, these victims they're not going to be made whole. I mean, that was never really going to happen anyway. It doesn't really happen in the bankruptcy process, but it's been a long time. I mean, think about some of these fire victims lost stuff in 2017. There's a small class that lost stuff in 2015. I mean, it's just been a really slow process and a very, very frustrating one, especially when you consider that like everybody made money here except for the fire victims.
I don't know what the better solution is. Is there one that you came across?
Not really. I mean, I will say this. I think that like we're talking earlier about this whole investor-owned utility model. And I think that there's a very strong argument to be made for like keeping these companies out of bankruptcy. right? It's
Right.
like the utilities do need to be financially healthy in order to serve everybody in the way that they're supposed to. If you have a utility bankruptcy like this, especially in the wake of a disaster, I mean, it's not going to end well for anybody, especially because, again, I mean, you've got these like really aggressive investors who are going to wring everything they can out of this distressed investment. And then like what's left, right? Like kind of like breadcrumbs for the people who actually suffered. And so I think that like another major utility bankruptcy like that would just be, I don't think it would end any better. And so I think if there's like a question for like state policymakers, regulators, it's like what can be done to sort of manage these sorts of liability costs in a way that is still just and equitable for fire victims while keeping the company out of like the restructuring process, because it's pretty disastrous.
Yeah. Well, to end on a more positive note, have there been any significant developments with PG&E that would be worth mentioning since the book came out?
Significant developments. It was interesting. I mean, the end of the book sort of closes with this idea that the new CEO had to bury 10,000 miles of power lines, the idea being these high-risk circuits go underground, they can't start wildfires. This was a really contentious thing, like last year when the company went to the regulator and said, we want permission to bury 2,000 miles as the first step in this bigger plan. And you kind of have consumer advocates and others come out swinging saying this is just too expensive. Like already, like inflation rates are XYZ, electricity rates are XYZ. Like, why are we going to add to it just for this sort of like experiment that PG&E wants to do to see if it can drive down costs? Ultimately, PG&E got permission to bury about 1,200 miles instead of 2,000, which is still a substantial amount. And like we'll see, PG&E's idea is that if they can do this at scale, then they can like line up the labor contracts and materials and other things that will ultimately make it less expensive over time. And the company's argument is like if the circuit's underground, even though it's expensive to put 1 mile of wire underground, it's cheaper over the 40-year life of the asset because we're not constantly trimming the trees and we're like not having to constantly go out and patrol and all this. And I think that is true. There's still like a question though about like, okay, like how much can you and I today be asked to bear to benefit like the customers 40 years from now? But nevertheless, I mean, we'll see. We'll see if PG&E can drive down costs. We'll see how this initial 1,200 miles goes over the next few years. If it's true, and if they are able to like drive down costs and make this more manageable, I mean, undergrounding could be a good solution in certain places and make the risk much less. But we have to see.
Yeah, we'll have to see. But in the meantime, yeah, I would encourage everyone to read your book, particularly if you live in Northern California. I think it would be particularly meaningful as to better understanding the energy system that helps power this region. Katherine, thank you so much for doing this. It's much appreciated.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.